First, on the passing of George H.W. Bush, your great friend and our great president, there's been a tsunami of commentary about the contrast between his life and style and others. Most pointedly, Donald Trump. What do you make of that?
Well, I make of that there is a considerable difference in the way each of these individuals handle their presidents. I'm, for one thing, Jim, completely delighted to see that history is appreciating the accomplishments of George H.W. Bush. And you know, that started before he died. I can remember 3 or 4 years before he died when I was with him, and I said, you know, Heffy, I called him Heffy because that's Spanish for chief. I always called him president when he was president and when we were anybody else was in our company. But after we got out, I had a tough time calling him George anymore, so I called him Heffy. I said, you know, Heffy, I'm delighted to see history.
You called him Heffy?
Heffy. Heffy. That means chief.
Yeah, I know.
For you. It's
yeah. I got it.
I said, I'm delighted to see history giving you credit for what you accomplished before you're gone. He said, is it? I said, yeah, it sure is. And that's how modest he was, of course. But he was a really incredible president from the standpoint of his accomplishments. Some of that got hidden by virtue of the fact that he was a one-term president. Mm-hmm. But he was a very consequential president in those 4 years, particularly in foreign policy.
Yeah. What would you add to that, Secretary Tillerson?
Well, I think, and I am too pleased that the recognition of the accomplishments of our 41st president are really being brought into focus because they were extraordinary for the 4 years that he served. And I think we were reflecting at the table a little bit too on how he handled the whole dissolution of the Soviet Union and the ending of the Cold War, and the stories have been told about not dancing on the wall. And I think that level of understanding of your counterpart and longtime adversary and understanding the culture of the Soviet people and what they were coming out of really shows his instincts and his insights of how to set the stage for a future relationship. And I learned and took some of those lessons away from watching him and how I dealt with foreign leaders, and in particular how I've dealt with Russia and how I've dealt with President Putin over the years, about not ever putting them in a position of embarrassment, because it's part of their culture. And if you want to win and you want to have a relationship where you're going to deal with difficult issues, I think it's important to keep that in mind. And it was a lesson I learned early on by just watching how he handled that.
Yeah. Well, back to my question about contrast. You, Secretary Tillerson, have just had a very public exchange of views, you might call it, with President Trump, and still hanging there, unanswered as far as I know. The recent allegation that while you were Secretary of State, you showed yourself to be dumb as a rock and lazy as hell. I hereby, as a public service, grant you time to respond if you choose to do so.
Well, that must have been an observation of my current state of affairs. I'm trying to be very lazy these days, but my wife tells me I'm failing, so.
So you're not going to, you don't have a response? That's your response?
I have no response to that.
Yeah. Well, he just proved his point, didn't he? But, okay, moving right along then. In foreign affairs, the general differences between the times of George H.W. Bush and the times now of Donald Trump. Two different world orders, and first in just a general sense, do you think?
Jim, I'm having trouble hearing you. So what was the last part of your question?
Two different world orders then and now?
Yes, absolutely different. You know, when I was up there with George H.W. Bush, everybody wanted to get close to Uncle Whiskers. Uncle Whiskers is the United States of America. But everybody wanted to get close to us. We had, in effect, won the Cold War, or we were winning it. And there was only one superpower left in the world. It was a little bit easier in those days to formulate foreign policy, not to implement it, that was still tough, but to formulate it, because it was rather easy. If the Soviets were against it, we were for it, and if the Soviets were for it, we were against it. And now that makes it sound extraordinarily easy, and I don't mean to do that, but the implementation was what was really important. George Bush knew foreign policy. He'd been director of the CIA, he'd been ambassador to China, he'd been ambassador to the United Nations. He knew the game. He knew how it was to be handled and how it was to be performed. And he particularly knew how to structure his national security apparatus. If you look back through the various presidencies going pretty far back, Jim, you'll see that in many of them, there was a lot of tension within the national security establishment. The Secretary of Defense would be fighting with the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of State would be fighting with the National Security Advisor. We didn't have that. We didn't have that because we had a leader who understood how a national security apparatus should be constructed, and he constructed his that way and then made sure that it performed that way. So I used to say we were the exception to the rule. And I said that even about the other wonderful president I worked for, Ronald Reagan. I worked for him for 8 years. In those 8 years, he had at least 7 national security advisors, because there was all this tension and fighting and leaking and all that stuff that goes on. Why does it happen? It happens because everybody in Washington, Rex knows this well, everybody in Washington wants to get a piece of the foreign policy turf.
Why?
Because they want to have that authority.
The power of dealing with the world?
Sure, it's power.
Yeah,
absolutely. Everybody, but President Bush was smart enough and knowledgeable enough and adroit and adept enough to make sure that didn't happen in his administration.
Now, Secretary Tillerson, there's no way I could avoid asking you the natural follow-up question to that is, compare what Jim Baker just said about what it was like back in his time, George H.W. Bush's time, and your time with the Trump administration.
Well, it may surprise you to hear that when we joined the administration, we actually had conversations about wanting to reinstitute the Baker-Scowcroft model of national security. I looked back and certainly had been an observer as an American citizen of how national security councils had operated under the prior administrations. And looking at that model, it was one of the most effective. Now, granted, and I think Jim's exactly right, you had a president that was very deep in his own understanding of foreign affairs issues, which he provided great leadership for that group. But we did, Secretary Mattis, myself, General McMaster, when he joined as the National Security Advisor, had conversations about trying to follow that type of model. And we did try to follow that type of model during the time I was there. But those natural tensions that Secretary Baker's talking about, they're part of the Washington scene. And it's not just inside the administration, but up on the Hill, in the Foreign Affairs committees and the Armed Services committees. Everybody wants a piece. And it puts enormous tension on those who are trying to conduct foreign affairs, and many times unwanted interference, well-intended. They may be well-intended, but it's unwanted interference in your relationships with how you're trying to carry out the execution of the policy itself.
And I think we ought to also add that you guys in the Fourth Estate bear some responsibility for this because you love divisiveness. Discord and divisiveness sell. Comity doesn't sell. So anytime you get an argument going between the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense or the National Security Advisor, big headlines, right? I mean, agreement? Nothing.
Sir, if I may say so, unaccustomed as I am to answering questions rather than asking them, I would point out to you that my experience, 50 years in journalism, that journalists are unable to create chaos, that they're terrific at reporting it.
Yeah.
Okay, but you don't want the American public to know when the Secretary of State and the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the wah-wah and the they and the wah-wah all disagree? That's journalism, sir. Well, but moving right along.
I grant you that, Jim, but it's the degree of coverage.
Oh, the degree.
The degree. Yeah, you get a hell of a lot more coverage of a fight than you do of the agreements.
Yeah. I'm not the least bit defensive about this. Don't worry. Everybody has their misunderstandings. A lot of people misunderstand the whole function of journalism, but that's not what this is about. This is about the two of you and foreign affairs. So let's be specific here. Let's just a little kind of go around the world. And what you think in terms of comparing from past to present, or just your analysis of what's going on. Let's start with North Korea, threat of nuclear war. How do you read that situation right now?
Well, it is a very serious threat. I think the policy and the approach that was developed early on in this administration was the correct approach to take, and that was the air strategic patience is over, and we began the maximum pressure campaign, which was composed of several elements and really went beyond, I think, what had been attempted in the past in terms of putting pressure on the regime of North Korea, not just through the UN Security Council resolutions and the sanctions, but going deeper into a lot of the illicit activities that North Korea carries out, from human trafficking to drug trafficking to weapons sales, to try to disrupt the flow of resources. And then the key element of that was convincing China that it was in their best interest to work with us to bring this to an end and ultimately begin to reverse it. And I think we were successful in gaining the Chinese support, and they took a lot of steps, went much further than they had ever gone before themselves in putting pressure on North Korea. It did bring the North Koreans to the table with their contacting the White House through the South Korean envoys that they wanted to talk. That was what we were waiting on, was them finally saying, okay, it's time to sit down and talk. That was an important signal. From there on, how tactically we would have handled it, I would have handled it probably a little differently than it has been. Now, watching as an outside observer, because I don't have the day-to-day reports obviously any longer, I am concerned that a lot of that pressure is beginning to come off, and have read the recent reports out there that the weapons productions continue inside of North Korea, facilities continue to be maintained. So I am concerned that all of the effect of that policy early on, which accomplished what we wanted to accomplish, whether we've now that's been diminished, and whether or not we can ever recreate that, I think is going to be challenging. We have to be very clear-eyed. North Korea has never been forthright in anything they've done in the past, and so we knew this was going to be a long effort. It's not going to be solved quickly. And at the time, I told the president, I said, this is going to take all of your first term to try to get us to a place where we can begin to reverse. We won't have it reversed. And so I think that's still the case, and we still need the help of those allies. We need to be very unified with our two greatest allies, Japan, South Korea, but also we're going to need the help of the Chinese. And my view of Russia is we could just keep them from interfering in it. I didn't expect the Russians to particularly help us, but if we could keep them from interfering and keep the Chinese engaged in a positive way to solve the problem. So I am concerned that we may have lost some ground from where we were. I don't want to say, though, that it's not still viable to continue that effort.
Okay. How do you feel about it?
I feel pretty much the same way that Rex does, Jim. I think the outreach could prove to be worthwhile. I worry that anytime we have had a dialogue, subterranean or otherwise, with the North Koreans, we get a lot of promises but no action. And I'm afraid that's where we're headed now. I mean, I worry that we've seen this movie before. We saw it in the Clinton administration when they changed a policy we had in place, one of strength and resolve and determination, to one of sort of conciliation and dialogue and so forth. It didn't work. We tried it again in 43's administration. It didn't work. We got promises, but we never got performance. So I'm worried about that, just as I think.
What about Iran? It's part of the...
Iran? Iran?
Iran.
Well, you want to know what I think about it?
What do you think?
I think we shouldn't have gotten into the negotiation to begin with.
Shouldn't have gone into them?
I think the Obama administration made a mistake in negotiating with Iran and walling off their terrorist activities all around the world. Say, we're going to negotiate with you, but just on your production of nuclear weapons. We're going to give you all this money, $150 billion or something, and we do want to talk to you about nuclear weapons, but your other behavior is going to be over here on the side and not even going to talk about it. I think having gotten into that negotiation was a mistake.
Okay. But it's been done now, so what do we do about it?
Well, I think that was President Trump's view as well, obviously from the beginning, is that we cannot ignore all of their other behavior throughout the region. They are the largest state sponsor of terrorism in that region. They're very destabilizing to the region, as we see with the proxy wars that they have started or involved themselves in Syria and Yemen. And so it was a huge mistake to have ever allowed an agreement that parted those two and set them aside. That's where the president had his problem as well, and that's why when the agreement was finally withdrawn from, it was almost the basis that, look, you don't get a pass on this stuff over here just because you're complying with the technical terms of a nuclear deal.
Could it lead to a blow-up of some kind? Have we got a possibility of a serious confrontation with Iran where people start shooting at each other?
Well, I think it'd be a terrible miscalculation on the part of the Iranian regime if they were to do that.
So you don't think it'll happen?
So I think they are smart enough and measured enough not to take the United States on directly, but their malign activities throughout the region, they will likely continue. I think one of the best things we have going for us in Iran is the Iranian people themselves. And the Iranian society is still a very intelligent society. They're a very vibrant society. And I think they are tiring of the results of the actions that have been taken by their leaders in these other proxy wars and these destabilizing activities.
Should the U.S. stay in NATO?
What? Say it again, Jim.
Should the U.S. stay in NATO? Should the United States remain active and be a member of NATO?
Well, absolutely, we ought to stay in NATO, and we ought to continue to lead NATO. NATO has been the most successful security alliance in history.
You agree?
No question about it. And I think continuing to expand NATO membership has been important. It is one of the best security fronts to counter Russian belligerent behavior that we have today. And I think it is important that the NATO membership do their part, strengthen their own defense capabilities, which they are now doing.
It'll come as no surprise to both of you that the president does not agree with the two of you on this about NATO. But just for the record, I'm not making trouble. I'm just pointing out a little fact.
I think he does agree with that.
No, he doesn't agree. He wants the United States to pull out of NATO.
I think what he wants to do is for our NATO allies to pay their fair share. And there's nothing wrong with that.
You think I've learned a lesson by now, Secretary Tillerson, not take this guy on here. But
yeah, I'm going to say, you've been through this before with him.
Been through this before. With all due respect, all the way. Speaking of respect, the introducing you, and I'm not criticizing the introduction, but there's just one thing that was not in there. When he said you were one of America's greatest political operators, you're also a leading American statesman that beyond being George H.W. Bush as Secretary of State, and etc. You did? Yeah. Did you? I hope to hell you heard that, Baker.
I heard that. I had no trouble hearing that.
You got to watch him. He's trying to score points now.
That's right. Now watch what the next question is.
Secretary Baker, what is it going?
Here it comes.
What is it going to take to finally have peace in the Middle East?
Boy, I don't know, Jim. When I left office 25 plus years ago, having been involuntarily retired from public service, I thought that during my lifetime we would see peace between Arabs and Israelis. I no longer believe that, and that's sad, because I do believe that the people on both sides of that issue are tired of being perpetually at war. I think most Israelis are sick of being a nation perpetually at war, and I'm sure that the Palestinians probably feel the same way. I think there is a deal there to be made, to be had. It's going to be very hard to accomplish it given what's going on now. But I guess I'm still hopeful, but I'm afraid it won't happen in my lifetime since I am 88 years old. But it may happen in Rex's lifetime.
What do you think? You have a view on what could, is there a magic formula or not?
Well, I would agree with Jim's assessment that I think the people on both sides are ready. And it's a failure of the leadership to find that accommodation that they feel that they can follow through with a peace accord. There have been a couple of moments in time when I thought we were close and it would happen. You know, when Yasser Arafat walked away from the deal, that was the first best opportunity we had. And then recently, with the breakdown in relationships with the Palestinian leadership, I think it was on a very good trajectory for a while. And there has been, I think, better support among the broader Arab community to try to bring this to an end as well, because of so much violence in the region itself. If we could solve this one, there's a belief by many of the leaders that would bring the level of violence in the region itself down. But I think it can be solved. Unfortunately, I don't see the leadership in place today that's going to achieve that peace. And so it's going to take the right leaders on both sides for it to happen. But I agree with Jim. I think both peoples are ready. They're ready for it. Why their leadership can't seem to get to that point that's the hurdle.
The U.S. leadership can't accomplish this. That's over, right?
Say that again.
U.S. leadership is no longer possible for the U.S. to lead a viable move toward peace.
Well, I think it's very difficult where it stands today because of the relationship with the Palestinian leadership and the U.S. Obviously, over the decision around the embassy move to Jerusalem, kind of that relationship deteriorated over that.
You were opposed to that, right?
I was opposed to the timing of it. Again, almost all of President Trump's objectives I agreed with. I think he had the right objective. He has the right objectives. Tactics is where he and I tended to have our differences. And the timing of the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, I disagreed with, because at that time we still were on a pathway of what we thought were going to be viable talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
The Khashoggi killing, what do you make of the U.S. reaction to that and the way they've handled it, the United States government? No, I'm not saying they killed Khashoggi. No, how the U.S. has handled the reaction to,
I'm looking at you because I'm wondering if you're asking me that or asking Ray.
I'm asking you, Secretary.
Here's what I think. I think that in formulating and implementing foreign policy for the United States of America, You have got to consider our principles and values, and you've got to consider the national interest. The two are often in conflict. They are in conflict with respect to this situation. So the president and his administration are going to have to come up with something along the lines that President George H.W. Bush did when China killed tens of thousands of peaceful demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. He had the wisdom and foresight to know that that clearly violates our principles and values, and that we needed to do something about it, but we needed to do it in a way that kept the relationship alive, that didn't just sever U.S. Diplomatic relations with China. And he did that. We sanctioned China. We put some rather serious sanctions on China, but he sent word privately to China, we don't intend this to mean a complete rupture of our relationship with you. Something like that needs to happen here.
But it hasn't happened up till now, correct?
Hasn't happened.
Has not happened.
Well, the administration would say it's happened because they put some sanctions on. The question is whether those are sufficient sanctions, that you get argument both sides on that.
Secretary Tillerson, what do you think about
Well,
it?
I think this has been a difficult issue to manage in many regards because of the implications around the Crown Prince's direct involvement and not having access to a lot of the intelligence myself. I wouldn't want to comment as leaning one way or the other, but I think that is part of the complication here is when there's an implication that the leader, or certainly the second in command, the guy who's basically running the country was directly involved. That makes it a really tough issue to manage as to how to convey to the country, which is it's a monarchy run by the king and the crown prince, that you want to maintain the relationship broadly, but you cannot abide by that kind of behavior. I think the sanctioning of the 16 or 17 individuals, that's a step. I think in the eyes of most it's an insufficient step, and I think that's what the sentiment of the people on the Hill and in the Senate is, that that's not sufficient of a step. And so it's all, in all likelihood, there's going to be additional action that's going to be demanded by the Senate to send a stronger message. Clearly that relationship, though, with the Saudi government and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is crucial to our national security interest in the region, and so it's important that they understand, I think as Jim was saying with China, that this is not an intention on our part to abandon this relationship, nor is it an intention on our part to drive you into the arms of one of our adversaries. And that's the risk here, is that we drive them into the arms of an adversary like Russia or someone else. And so I think it is going to require a high level of diplomatic deftness in order to ensure it's understood what we're condemning, but what we also want to continue to nurture.
But is it not possible, say to both of you, is it not possible that the condemnation is more important in this case than furthering the relationship? That if the Crown Prince, as the CIA apparently has said, was personally responsible for the murder of Khashoggi, then isn't that condemnation by the United States government more important than furthering the relationship if the Saudis don't acknowledge it, don't do something, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
I think it is. I mean,
do you?
Yeah.
You do. So it is. Okay, great. I can take yes for an answer. Yeah. Two big things. Both these countries have come up thus far in passing, but let's put it directly. Secretary Baker, how would you describe the nature of our relationship, the U.S. relationship with Russia right now? And what should it be if it isn't?
What should it be?
Yeah.
Well, it ought to be what it was for 15 years after George H.W. Bush so adroitly managed the end of the Cold War. For 15 years, after the wall came down, after the Soviet Union imploded, we had a very good relationship with Russia. The entire West had a good relationship with Russia under both Putin and Yeltsin. Yeltsin first and then Putin. That's the kind of thing we ought to try to get back to if we can. Our relationship with Russia today is damn near a Cold War relationship. I mean, I was the last Cold War Secretary of State of the United States, and I don't see a lot of difference today in where we are than where we were those years when I was Secretary of State, until, say, 91, when the Soviet Union imploded.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Tillerson, what's your view on Russia?
Well, it is in a very bad place. When I went to see President Putin, I think it was early March after I'd been sworn in on February the 1st, and I've known him a very long time. I first met him in 1999, and we've had many, many opportunities to be together. And I told him then, I said, this relationship is in a very bad place, but it can get worse than it is today. And I said, we can't have that kind of relationship. I think he acknowledged and agreed that it was in a bad place. What wasn't clear to me is whether he wanted it to be better or not at this time. I think it's unfortunate that he has taken a lot of actions that have damaged this relationship. I think our response to those actions has been inadequate, and that's why he continues on the path he's on. And that began with his taking of Crimea, and our response to his taking of Crimea was completely inadequate.
I agree with that.
Which led him to invade East Ukraine, which led him to take the lead in supporting the Assad regime and the war in Syria, and now back to Ukraine. And he's feeling very emboldened because there has never been an adequate response to those actions on his part. And that is the way he is going to continue to, I think, to advance his own agenda until he sees the pushback that is sufficient, and thus far it's been insufficient.
Do you feel that he may be further emboldened by what has been described as a relationship that President Trump has with Russia, and particularly President Putin?
I have no idea.
Thanks a lot. Do you have an idea?
I'll be honest with you, Jim. I don't know I don't know what President Trump's relationship is to President Putin or Russia. I was with him for the first summit. It was just the two of us in Hamburg. President Putin had his Foreign Secretary Lavrov and myself. It was just the four of us. It was supposed to be a 20-minute kind of get to know each other. It went an hour and 15 minutes. So we covered a lot of territory in that first meeting. To my knowledge, that's really the first time they ever had a substantive conversation between them, but that's to my knowledge.
Well, I made a promise to myself in the mirror that this would be a Mueller-less discussion, and it is, okay? We're going to China. What are the Chinese our friends? Are they our competitors? Are they our enemies? Should we have trade wars with them? What's the deal with China? What should be our deal with China?
They're our competitors. You're talking to the Secretary of State who worked very hard to get them in the WTO.
Oh, yeah?
And you're talking to somebody who's sorely disappointed that they haven't lived up to the obligations they took on when they joined the WTO. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think it's extraordinarily important that the United States have the best possible relationship we can with China. How our policymakers relate to the emergence of China as the next global superpower is critically important. So therefore, let me back up. Therefore, I support what President Trump is trying to do, which is to bring China around to compliance with their obligations in the international trading regime. I may have some difference with respect to the tools he's using. Tariffs are tough. Tariffs can backfire on you. Now, so far, tariffs have gotten their attention, and this may end up being a very good result. It, on the other hand, may not. I would have preferred to see the administration, and I bet this is where Rex was, but I don't know. I would have preferred to see the administration embrace the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a very important element of U.S. leadership in Asia. Now we have a situation where China is the preeminent power in Asia. all those countries in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we repudiated in effect, they're getting screwed by China to the same extent that we are. Technology transfer, you can't do business there if you don't give them your technology and all that. So I think it would have been far better to get them on board with us and then have a unified front against China not living up to their obligation.
Secretary Tillerson.
Well, that was why I supported our staying with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP, so that we could deal with China with a more unified front, along with our European allies, because everyone is suffering from the same effects of how China is conducting its global trading. I will say this: China, though, it's probably the most important relationship that we get right. China is the rising nation on the planet. They've moved 500 million people out of poverty in the last 15 to 20 years. And as they move these people out of poverty to these giant cities on the coastal areas, they've developed this growing middle class. And in talking with President Xi, he said, you know, that is changing the culture of China. It's changing the culture of the Chinese people. And he said to me, the greatest threat we face is not from outside. The greatest threat we face is from within. Because as we grow this middle class, we have to prove to the Chinese people every day that communism still works for them. And so their need to be successful and continue the economic engine of China is vital to the survival of the regime itself. That's why this issue is so critical to them. It's why their whole strategy of the Belt and Road initiative is built around securing that economic viability with military strength around the world to secure its trading routes. That is creating some very dangerous conditions for the future with the islands that have been built, the militarization of those islands. What they clearly want to do is raise the price of any conflict with the United States in the Pacific. That you don't want to have a conflict with us because the cost to you will be extraordinary. So we've allowed over the last decade, because I think we weren't properly paying attention or we weren't properly managing that situation, staying ahead of it, that we allowed it to now to get to the point it is, that if not managed carefully, it could lead to a conflict in the future, which no one wants. Neither of us want that. So it is important we get it right. We have to accommodate China's economic growth. They're not going to live with us any other way. But in doing so, we can be extraordinarily successful too.
Finally. You know the word finally, that is a great television word. That means brief answers as we go. The question is this. Both of you are Republicans. Both of you have experience with the Foreign Service, with appointed folks, with the Congress of the United States, with all these other things involving the implementation of the foreign policy of the United States of America. Sitting here today, would you recommend that anybody who had an opportunity to join the Trump administration foreign affairs operation as an intern, as a foreign service officer, as an ambassador, or even as Secretary of State, what would be your advice to your fellow Republican-leaning folks?
Where you want mine? You want mine?
Yes.
Absolutely. We need good people in our government. We need people to join our government in the career ranks, and you've got to have it if you're going to have an effective and efficient foreign policy. So I would encourage people. Doesn't matter really. It doesn't matter that much who's at the very top of it.
Doesn't matter who's the president?
Yeah, it matters who the president is, of course, to the guy. But it doesn't matter in terms of the way you phrase the question. Should a person come into the career service or not? They should absolutely come in to serve their country, and they'll find it very rewarding after they've done so.
But I also included appointment as Secretary of State or an ambassadorship or whatever. You're saying do that too?
I would say do that too if you have a clear understanding of what the job is with your boss. Of course, I didn't have to have that. My boss was my friend for 40 years, and he was my daughter's godfather, and I ran his political campaigns, so I didn't have any trouble with that.
I got it. Secretary Tillerson?
I would say absolutely. You will never regret serving your country, regardless of who you're working for.
I want to thank the two of you, and I think that you proved that the guidelines were followed, each in your own way. And I remember saying to both of you earlier that when I started covering politics in Texas, the first thing I was told by a learned Texas politician, hey, Jim, it isn't whether or not the question is answered, it's how well the question was handled. So, I hereby commend you for handling my questions. Thank you very much.